Hello everyone. I would like to open the session for the National Centre for Cultural Competence Leadership Program. The panel session is What is Cultural Competence Leadership? My name is Jennifer Barrett. I'm the Director of the Centre and I'll be your host today. To begin the session, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians on the land that I'm sitting on here today, which is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. This is a land that was never ceded. I'd like to think that we continue today with that tradition of passing on and creating new languages and new knowledges, new ways of thinking about leadership. In the tradition that we've established in the Indigenous strategy and services portfolio, I'd like to also invite our panelists, Lisa Jackson-Pulver and Jason Ardler, to also contribute to that acknowledgement. I'll then do a more formal introduction and give our friends here who've joined the webinar an opportunity to hear about how we're going to organise today's session. So Lisa, over to you.
Well, hello everybody. I'd also like to lend my voice to the respects of country. I'm coming to you from beautiful Gadigal country in the centre of Sydney. I'm at the University of Sydney's city-based campus, and although I usually work at the Camperdown-based campus, both the Gadigal land and, as Jennifer said, never ceded, never sold, and certainly a place that's been known, loved and nurtured since the beginning of time.
Thank you, Lisa. Jason.
Thank you and good afternoon, everybody. I'm beaming in from Dharawal country down in the Sutherland Shire, and I know the Shire can polarise people's opinions, so I'm quick to point out that I live here. I'm not from here, but I do want to pay my respects to Dharawal elders, past and present. I want to thank them for their wisdom, for their custodianship of this quite beautiful land and the waterways in the Shire, and acknowledge the strength of all First Nations people in sustaining the world's oldest surviving cultures that have endured and prevailed despite intergenerational trauma and systemic racism being experienced by so many. It's good to be here.
Thank you, Jason. It's great to acknowledge that, particularly during this time where we're all working from many different places, that we continue to build on our acknowledgement of country and pay our respects to elders past, present and future. So today I want to let you know that our session is being recorded and will be available on the NCCC's Yammer page. I'd also like to thank you all for attending today's session and invite you a bit later on in the session, around 1:30, I'd invite you to start your Q&A in the Q&A section of the panel down below, and we'll take those questions and deal with them as a group. Today's session is not a series of presentations. What we decided was that we would have a conversation about what is cultural competence leadership. In the panel, we will explore what are the essential elements of culturally competent leadership. And our panelists will share their understanding of what cultural competence is and their experiences of leading in this context. What qualities are essential to be a culturally competent leader, and what are the challenges they have faced? What advice can they offer to people wanting to develop their cultural competence leadership? So as you know, joining us, we have Professor Lisa Jackson-Pulver. Professor Jackson-Pulver is Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Indigenous Strategy and Services at the University of Sydney. She's a public health epidemiologist, a board member of the Australian Medical Council, a member of the Australian Statistical Advisory Council, and a member of the South Australian Health Performance Council. She serves her country in the Royal Australian Air Force Specialist Reserve and has moved through the ranks from her initial commission as Flight Lieutenant to current rank of Group Captain. Jackson-Pulver is an academic leader, a recognised expert in public health. She's a prominent researcher, a visionary, and a tireless advocate for health and education, and her artworks adorn the reports she writes. Welcome, Lisa. Jason Ardler is an Aboriginal man from the Yuin Nation of the New South Wales South Coast, and he's a founding member of the Thirawee, 100% Aboriginal-owned business venture. Jason and David Major established Thirawee to share their extensive knowledge and experience with others, and to support them in building their own strong, successful and adaptive communities and organisation. The organisation, Thiriwi, is the word Muktung word for, it's the Muktung word for ironbark. It is tough, textured and enduring, rooted deeply and firmly in country and culture. It represents the organisation's commitment to working with tenacity and perseverance to deliver quality services and solutions. Jason is an experienced senior executive and board member, passionate about improving the well-being of others, their communities and their environment. He has a reputation for achieving things others say can't be done and finding innovative solutions to difficult problems. Before establishing Thiriwi, Jason was the Deputy Secretary for Aboriginal Affairs in New South Wales, and for more than 20 years he successfully led strategy and reform in public policy for the New South Wales Government. In 2018, he received the Public Service Medal for Outstanding Service to Indigenous people in New South Wales, and in 2019 was made a Fellow of the Australian-New Zealand School of Government. Now that's my formal introduction to our two people. So welcome, as I said, again, and I'd like to just start off with exploring some of the questions that we sent to the panelists earlier, and we're going to begin with looking at your approach to implementing cultural change in your previous roles. And then I'd like to move on to what you're doing now. So I'm looking at the past and the future, and I'd like both of you to draw on how that change has then informed your approach more broadly. Is there a core competence or a core attribute that you take into each of those settings? So I'll go to you first, Lisa.
Thank you. Really appreciate the opportunity of speaking here. I put a question in to the comments, and I said I'd love to know where everyone's coming in from, and I'm just delighted to see so many people beaming in from all parts of Sydney, acknowledging country. It's a very powerful thing, isn't it, to be able to take a deep breath and feel where we are, and to know that this place, as Jason rightly said, has been a place that's always been known and has always had a culture and a longing and a belonging since time began. Certainly some of the work that I've done in the past, people often say, how do we become culturally competent? How do we do cultural safety? And in the early days of cultural awareness, there were people desirous of tick boxes. If I do this thing, does that mean, I can tick that and then that means I'm culturally competent, or I'm culturally safe, or I'm culturally aware, or I'm culturally sensitive, or I'm culturally congruent, or, whatever words it is. Mm. And for me, I think over the years, it's been very much around a journey of recognising who you are in context, becoming comfortable in your own skin. And by that, I mean being comfortable with your own history and your own journey, how you got here, your ancestors, whether you came 60,000 years ago or before, or whether you're like me, with a descent that's both of this country and of the invaders. I also have Welsh and Scottish heritage. Or whether it's someone who's come even more recently, but at the end of the day, it's really about how we belong. And how we have an obligation to understand the history of this place and to appreciate the story and journey that it's been on. There is nothing new under the sun in this land. All knowledge has always been known. It's how we interpret it, it's how we share it, and how we apply it nowadays. And so for me, I think the whole journey around what is cultural competence, what is cultural leadership, what's cultural sensitivity is very much enwrapped in how comfortable one feels in their own skin, and the recognition that they have when they're engaging with others or with knowledges that are different than their own, that there is a sensitivity and a respect, in many ways respect, that's required.
Thank you. And so what we might do a bit later too is explore how that then plays out in some of the places you've worked in, and I think too of the forces, the armed forces, and how that sort of how that context might be particularly challenging in terms of being comfortable in your own skin. But I'll ask you, Jason, to also respond to the same question about your approach to implementing cultural change. And, you know, is there a core competence or a core approach that you use?
Yeah, so I think what I always find interesting about my approach to leadership generally is I often say that most of what I know has been learned from working with people that I thought did it badly. And so I never wanted to be one of those sort of CEOs or leaders who would come into an organisation and try to make their new organisation into their old organisation because it fit or it reflected a particular worldview that they brought with them. And I've been in situations where heading up a small organisation that was merged with a very large organisation, and the greeting was around, you know, we're really glad you've joined us. The work you do is really important. We really admire the way you engage with your stakeholders. We're really envious of your staff satisfaction levels. Now, here are all the processes and here are all the templates that we need you to use so you can be more like us. And so that's the bad and the ugly, I guess. So for me, my experience certainly has been that those sorts of approaches to cultural change, really what they do is create resentment and passive aggressiveness, I think, in people. And to the extent that they create cultural change at all, it really comes through fear of retribution more than anything else. And that makes it a really fragile thing. So that's what doesn't work, I guess. My starting point is always around clarity of vision and clarity of purpose. What's our narratives? You know, why are we here? Who are we here for? How do we want to be seen and spoken about? And what does that mean for the way we work and for the way we define our success? And if we're a small organisation and we're reliant on others, you know, being able to influence others, then how do we make our success their success? Are we good partners? They're the kinds of things that I want us thinking about when we're talking about our culture. If I'm building a team, I want a team with diversity of experience, diversity of personality, diversity of operating styles, and diversity of cultures. You know, I'm not looking for a team of mini-me's. I don't need that. You know, I know my strengths, and I think that's really important. And it's a bit like Lisa was saying about knowing yourself, you know, knowing who you are, being comfortable in your own skin. I know my strengths. You know, I'm comfortable with my strengths. I know that they sit largely in the domain of strategy and relationship. So I need people around me who are more operational, who are more into the detail, who can look at my crazy idea and go, that's just nuts, you know, and I may not agree with them, but I need to hear that sort of thing. So I need diversity in the organisation. So an organisation built around cultural diversity for me is really important to getting things done. You know, and by the same token, I also know that where and how I grew up is different for every single other person on the planet. Unless they grew up in my household, in my hometown in the 1980s, they're not me. They're going to be different to me. And being able to respect that, being able to understand that, being very conscious of the limitations, I guess, that on me that come from my own experiences and my own biases, and understanding those and accepting those, and being prepared to go out and seek alternative views and alternative experiences. For me, it's important that an organisation reflects the diversity of the people that you're there to serve. You know, I come out of public service, most recently Aboriginal Affairs, and understanding then that in Aboriginal people and Aboriginal cultures are not homogenous either. You know, we have a diversity of views. I grew up on the South Coast, people in Wilcannia, people in Burke, people in the Pilliga have very different experiences, have different world views, have different values and cultures. So understanding all of that, ultimately what I seek to do, what I sought to do with Aboriginal Affairs, and I think did it pretty well, was to build an organisation where people felt physically, emotionally and psychologically safe to share their ideas, to share their opinions, to share their cultural diversity, to feel that they belonged to something or making a contribution to something that was bigger than themselves. and felt appreciated for the contribution that they made and the attitude that they brought into the workplace, and for the diversity of their ideas and their values. That was really important. I would say I once had a colleague, and I'm going back about 15 years ago now, and he was a senior executive in a government department that I was working in, and he said to me once, Jason, I'm more than happy to employ Aboriginal people as long as they leave their Aboriginality at the door when they get to work. And it sounds appalling, right? You think, oh my God, even 15 years ago, I can't believe that.
Wow.
But I've got to say, I think you could replace Aboriginality for another ethnic group or another socially diverse group. And I'm not sure that attitude has altogether gone away. So I think we are challenged in this notion of being culturally competent.
Yeah.
So it requires commitment. It requires us to talk about it often, and being consistent with that, noticing the good behaviours, noticing the bad behaviours and cutting them out, and really being the change that you want to see. You have to walk the walk on this stuff.
Yeah, right. Well, thank you. You've then led me into, I guess, the next question, really, which is about values, because I think, you've just talked about how your own values have been important in terms of inspiring you in this work. So, Lisa, I'd just like you to explore that a bit further too. What role do your personal values play in your approach to leadership, and how do you approach your leadership role when it is in conflict with the culture of an organisation? So, thinking about any kind of organisation that you've worked in, we'd like to hear some of your reflections on that, and then I'll also ask Jason to continue the conversation.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a very tricky thing, and Jason's right. I can't count the times he's sort of been asked, and I'm sure there are others in the audience that have been asked to leave that diversity at the door, or leave that age or gender or whatever at the door, and come in. What we're really after, I think, in the world now is authenticity. And it's very, very hard to bring your whole self into a workplace or into dealing with wicked problems, or dealing with anything really, if you're only bringing a part of you which is a facade, a part of you that just does that autonomous type thing, that thoughtless approach to be able to, just do something and not be something. And I think the world is seeing at the moment the cost of what inauthenticity brings. We're seeing a world at the moment that's not communivist in nature, that has gone fiercely independentist. And what is happening with health, for example, is that people are saying, I have a right to, for example, not wear a mask, to not practice the type of hygiene measures and social distancing measures. I'm young. Why should I care if other people get unwell for this thing? And I'm putting a brutality around some of the narrative, particularly in the earlier days of COVID. But this is still something that we're seeing very strongly in communities abroad, and also sadly in our own communities here in Australia. And so for me, I think the whole construct of what values are and what you need to do to bring them into an environment in which you have the honour of participating, and that you have a role in, and some call that leadership. You have to recognise that you're a function of the people around you, you're a function of the team. And this is one of the things that I think Aboriginal people, we have a real problem with, is that when we're told to sell ourselves in a job interview, or to put your perspective, out there, again, there's no such thing as your perspective. It's always a we approach and an us approach. And I think it's one of those very difficult conversations that we need to have with the academy and with the bureaucracy about what does an individual bring and what does an individual get enhanced by those around them, right? So, that whole approach of authenticity, that whole approach of being a communivist, that whole approach of being inclusive and properly and rightly recognising that decisions that are important need to be made by a group. And that's not to get to a minimum common denominator agreement, but this is about a process that people go through to construct an agreed approach or an agreed decision. And then of course the final thing is very much around courage and being able to stand up and say, we need time to do this, we can't rush this through the gate the way you want, or stop, that doesn't sound right, I'm not quite sure why that doesn't sound right, let me get someone to help me deconstruct whatever it is you're saying. So courage, I think, is one of those things. The final thing I want to say on your question, Jen, is this word leader and leadership. I get really worried about the word leader and leadership. Not because I think it's not the right word in some contexts, but I think the whole idea of someone being a voice for many, many others in some kind of strange way, without all of those many others agreeing that that is the shared approach that we need to make. So often people get referred to as leaders of this group and leaders of that group. And often it's another person putting that word upon someone, and that's a heavy burden for someone to carry if they have not gone through a process to be a recognised leader. It's a term I dislike immensely when applied to the work that I do, because at the end of the day, what I do is nothing without the team and without the history and without what has come before. So just for me anyhow, that's you know, something that I'm really conscious about, something that I dislike.
So for you, you're saying leadership is about the team. So that in a way, it's about more than just one person. You're leading with a team.
It's about leadership. It's not only about the team, but it's about the process and how knowledge, for example, has been created. So someone might go off and win an award for something, but at the end of the day, without the history of that thing coming along, which has probably been contributed to by many, many people, you know, it's very hard to say, yep, that's my work alone.
Yeah.
I think it's leadership is a very Western approach to something that I have difficulty talking about. But when I see good leadership, I see, for example, in context, some people brought a statement to government a couple of years ago. It was on behalf of a large body of people who had been sharing thoughts and sharing stories and sharing ideas and understanding over a long period of time that got bought into this thing called the Uluru Statement from the Heart.
Yeah.
And the people who took that to Parliament were considered by the Western media to be the leaders of this.
Right.
You know, and this was something that they pushed back against. They said, no, this is the statement from all the people.
From the heart, yeah.
We're just the ones that are bringing it along. You know, we're bringing it to you fellas, you know, so please accept it.
Okay, so we'll come back.
That's when I see good leadership. So I have a real problem with that term leadership, and I'm very conscious of when it's applied inappropriately.
Okay, well, we'll come back to that actually. So Jason, your response to this, I mean, you partly answered it a moment ago, but, or maybe what you could do is even respond to that point that Lisa's just made in terms of leadership as a problematic word in this context, when we're talking about cultural competence.
Look, well done, Lisa, honestly, because I think that's a conversation that we need to have, and a conversation that, and we need to, talking about cultural competence, we need to find a safe way to have that conversation. Because, you know, I tend to think of leadership as not as a position of authority, but actually as an activity, you know. So the notion that we have leaders that don't lead is an oxymoron, because if you're not showing leadership, then you're not a leader, I think, by definition. And so for me, leadership is far more an informal thing. It is about the mandate that you're given, I think, and the authority that you're given informally by others, because you have a track record, because they trust you, because, you know, whatever it is. And it's not something that's about being appointed or anointed, in my view. And I think that, you know, in our context, and looking at this kind of emergence these days, and I may be treading on kind of slippery surface here, but even thinking about this notion of kind of emerging eldership or self-appointed eldership in our communities, or elders who are, you know, I had a cousin of mine came up to me once and said, you know, I'm 50 years old now, you need to call me uncle because I'm an elder. And I'm going, well, hang on a minute. You know, my dad's 86 and he doesn't have that attitude, you know, because it's never about that. So I agree with you. There is a conversation to be had about what leadership is and what it used to be and what it's kind of morphed into. I mean, I think the other things for me in thinking about your question is I'm very values driven. It influences where I work. It influences the way I work. You know, the public service is really important to me. Supporting others to better their lives is important to me. You know, my organisation, Theory Wary, our tagline is about building confidence, capability and connection for others to be able to do for themselves and to work differently. You know, so we're about thinking about how do Aboriginal communities, but also governments and other organisations have the confidence, the capability and the relationships to be able to work differently together, to work more respectfully together, to achieve mutually beneficial outcomes. And I think if you want to work in that way and those are your values, then you've really got to want to know people. You've really got to want to know what their aspirations are. You've really got to not be able, you know, suspend your own judgment, suspend your own bias, understanding that, you know, even me, you know, I've grown up and I've lived in relative privilege. And a lot of the people that I'm working with, that's not the case. A lot of the people we're all working with, that's not the case. So being able to suspend our judgment and our bias and really understand people and where they're coming from and what they aspire to for themselves and for their families and their communities is really important. Closing the gap's not that, you know, in Indigenous Affairs policy, it's something else. So that's, you know, they're the values that drive me. Authenticity, absolutely. You know, I'm often accused of oversharing. So, you know, what you see is what you get with me. You know, I try to be as real as I can. And I think the other one for me is responsibility. You know, I have a very strong sense of needing to take ownership of things that I commit to. You know, what that means is I probably say yes too often, and I probably you know, put too much energy into things that don't, you know, that maybe I shouldn't, you know, to try and do the best job that I possibly can. But it's all about, you know, wanting to help others. So.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, it's really interesting hearing about the values piece and also about how clearly you're both driven by personal values, but also knowing that there are different ways to take on sort of leadership as an activity. That, I mean, that's sort of, I must admit, in terms of my own work history in both the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, in the cultural sector, and also in, you know, recent roles, leadership roles, working on the culture strategy, that notion of facilitation or leading with a group is not always well recognised or well understood in institutions as being a form of leadership. And it's quite interesting in terms of how that then plays out. And it takes an organisation, I think, a while to get used to different ways of working with different ideas of leadership. And that's obviously one of the things I guess I'm hearing is what we're trying to change in that process going forward. So I'd like to just move on to the next set of questions that we were posing to you, and that is, what are the personal qualities, I mean, you've just partly talked about this in terms of your values, but what are the strategic imperatives that need to be considered for implementing cultural change and building on an organisation's capabilities in this area? So let's be, I mean, what people who are listening here will probably want to be, I mean, we're going to look at their questions in a moment, but people, there's an intellectual relationship with this idea of leadership and also cultural competence, but what are some of the practical sort of practical tools, the practical ways in which you deal with things? I mean, Jason, you just talked about being overly committed, maybe taking on too much. Lisa, you're also talking about, you know, being very inclusive in terms of the way you facilitate leadership groups. I mean, can we explore that a little bit further? Lisa?
Nothing like an easy question after lunch. Yeah, look, it's really tricky. The whole context of cultural competence, I think, is one that's, everyone has an opinion, everyone has a view, and many people consider themselves to be experts at this thing. And I know that when we, and I'll go back to some experience I had in defence. So when I was in defence, my father was a serviceman, my grandfather died in World War II, and great-grandparents. And so there's this long line, and there's very few Aboriginal people I know that haven't been touched by service to their country. And one of the questions a group of us was asked many, many, many years ago is why? Why do you lot don a uniform for a country when there was a time when you weren't considered to be citizens or human beings, or you weren't considered to be here? Why would you tell lies to recruiters to, you know, get your marching orders and hop on a boat and fight on foreign soil? And the answer that we agreed, you know, we had a long discussion about this, and, you know, went over quite a few evenings, was that ultimately it's an act of love. To serve country is an act of love. And Aboriginal people have been serving country since time began. Aboriginal people continue to serve country now, and it's always an act of love. And not only serving country in a uniform, it's serving country in a job. You know, Jason is a long-term bureaucrat. He is serving his country. He is serving his nation. He's serving his people. All of us in the academic sector, we are serving our country by growing the next cohorts and next generations of geniuses that are going to do extraordinary things into the future. We are all serving country. And as that service, we need to recognise that that must be first and foremost an act of love. So for me, getting leadership across the line with this thing called cultural competence, cultural safety, cultural awareness, whatever terms we're using, is really about inviting people to recognise what they're doing in their roles, what they're doing in their jobs, and inviting them to get behind that thing that says, oh, I've got to pay the rent, got to pay the mortgage, got to bring up the kids. What is behind that? And if you go far enough behind that, I'd almost put money on it being an act of love. And if we can agree on that as service to our country, service to our past, our current and our future, as an act of love, I think we can go a long, long way in bringing people along this journey of cultural safety, cultural competence, cultural awareness and cultural belonging.
Thank you, Lisa. Jason, over to you on that one. I mean, interesting bringing the word love in and service in this way. I just noticed on the corner of my eye, I've got a couple of people who are talking about service in terms of this and the sort of hierarchical way in which leadership's been understood. So Jason, how about you?
Interesting, Lisa. I like that a lot, but it makes me think about in the last year, I've got really into Donna Hicks's work on dignity, and I've written a little bit about it as well. And I think it's the same kind of notion, you know. So Donna Hicks, for those who don't know, is a conflict resolution expert who's done a lot of work in places like the Middle East and Cambodia and Northern Ireland and elsewhere, and has spent time talking to and trying to understand why, you know, perhaps small bands of guerrilla fighters can hold off huge armies and the like, and often what it comes down to is this notion of dignity and a sense that, you know, we're fighting for our dignity often, and in some ways this notion of restoring dignity is a stronger motivation for people than loss of life even. So I think it's the same notion really, whether you call it love or dignity. It's that same idea that, you know, don't come and violate these things that are important to us, because we will fight tooth and nail against you on that. So I think I think it's a good idea. You know, I'm getting asked a lot now that I've left the public service to come and work with other agencies around cultural competence, around their ability to engage with communities, a deeper engagement with communities. That's great. It's really positive. I think that there's so many organisations now who are wanting to do that and are wanting to do that in a deeper and more meaningful way. I certainly resist offers to come and do cultural awareness training. What I'm more inclined to do is say, let's just have a yarn. You know, let's just have a yarn. If you're open-minded enough to be able, wanting to expose yourself to a different set of ideas, if you're self-aware enough to recognize that your biases and your worldview maybe are holding you back, and that there are other perspectives out there and there are other ways of being, and you know, you want to increase your empathy, then let's just have a yarn. You know, that's my practical starting point these days, is, you know, and my business partner will say I've got to stop using this language because, you know, maybe some will take offense to it, but I think most people know what I mean when I say, let's have a bring out your dead conversation. You know, whatever you're afraid to ask, just put it on the table. This is a safe space. There's no dumb questions. There might be some dumb answers, but, you know, let's just start by having a yarn in an open-minded, open-hearted way.
Well, so that would be a good thing for people to follow up on. And obviously we'll probably be talking or mention yarning in the next panel session, where we're focusing on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership in particular. But I think what might be useful now is to turn to some of the questions. So I think some of our participants, people listening in, are sending questions that pick up on this. And I'll go to a question from Liz Gray to all panel members. And she asks, have you always seen yourself as a leader, or did you have an aha moment later in your career?
I'll start because Lisa's still on mute. Absolutely not. No way. No, I have the worst case of imposter syndrome that you can imagine. You know, I'm constantly waiting to be found out. I think the aha moment, I mean, and again, it comes back to my idea of positional authority and this notion of leadership. And the leadership piece really came to me. The aha moment for me was when I realized that people were paying such great attention to what I was saying. You know, you get up and you say stuff, and sometimes you kind of, it's quite off the cuff or almost sort of by the by, and you realize that people are actually hanging off every word you make, and they're talking about it. You know, why did he say that, or why didn't he say this? And I thought, so I guess that for me was, you know, this notion that you know, people pay attention to leaders. They don't always pay attention to people in authority, but if they see someone as a leader, then they probably are more likely to pay attention. And when I realised how closely people were paying attention to what I was saying and doing and how I was acting, that was my aha moment.
So it's that kind of acknowledgement that you're having an impact, and then going back to an earlier point that Lisa made about being comfortable in your own skin. In that you become more self-aware of that, and that's certainly, I must admit, that's been my experience as well, where I feel like getting involved with things became a way of feeling like I had agency in. Whether it's our organisation we're in now, or whether it was in some other community organisation I was involved with. So it's a really interesting point there. Lisa, how about you?
Yeah, look, I'm with Jason. I don't think there's that many of us that don't feel imposter syndrome acutely. The first time I marched into a university as a student, I thought, oh my God, they're going to find out that I don't belong here. I marched into medical school. I mean, what was I thinking? And it's it's really a constant thing, and that whole background comes back to you about, you'll never be good enough, you'll never be anything more than, like all of these things. I remember when I was a kid, I was asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I said, I want to be a brain surgeon, and it's like, yeah, kids like you do not do that. So forget that, get rid of it. So yeah, imposter syndrome's a really big deal. But you've also got that thing where I've never felt comfortable, as I've said before, being a leader. There's never been an aha moment. I've always been conscious of doing or going or recognising sometimes when people are elevated beyond their level of competence. And that's a real thing. And we've all seen that. And so what do? Do you tear them down, or do you build them up and get them competent real quick? Well, of course, I always go for the latter. And I really hope that people around me, if I'm ever in a role that I might be floundering in, that I can also expect some support. But I think, it's not so much leadership for me, but it's about what gets you out of bed every morning. Where is your passion? Where is your drive? And for me, my passion and drive is utterly around, I was given a chance to go to university and it changed my life. It changed the life of my sister and her kids, because her kids saw an opportunity for them to go to university, and one of them is soon to finish her degree in nursing. It has changed others in my world profoundly, a tertiary education and what that can bring. And, you know, for others, it's about, you know, someone who has done exceptionally well in whatever field, you know, that acts as a role model for others, as much as we might be shy about that or reticent about being that. At the end of the day, that is what is. So for me, that whole thing about being a leader is more about finding a groove that you really love doing and doing it to the very, very best that you can. And if you can't do a particular task, and Jason spoke about this earlier, make sure you surround yourself with people who are able to do those other things that the group needs to be able to do and forward. And for me, I think leadership, as uncomfortable as a term that is for me, is really about recognising your own deficiencies and those things that you can build and learn, and those things that you need to get others to do, and let them do their job. That's the other thing, is recognising talent and letting them go, letting them do their job, knowing that you've been able to give them a left and right of arc and give them guidance as needed. So
yeah, so thank you for that, Lisa. There's another question that's come in, and it picks up on that thing about being comfortable in your own skin, and it, I think, ties in with what you're just talking about now. And that question comes from Jen Thompson. She says, Lisa talks about being comfortable in our own skin. Is there a danger in being so comfortable that we are not open to the need for changing ourselves and leading others to expand our cultural competence? So sort of, do you just want to just touch on the end of that, or?
yeah, sure. And this is, complacency is a terrible thing. You know, I remember in the 90s, do you remember when everyone was doing this, Australians for reconciliation, we're going to be reconciled now, and then Mr. Howard came along and just tossed the whole lot on the floor and wiped his hands of it and, oh my God, you know, we're all hurt, we're all going to run away. You know, we were comfortable doing this, but now we're uncomfortable. And then we all marched across the bridge in 2000. Wasn't that a great day? Who was there? Boy, oh boy, wasn't that a fabulous thing? You know, and then something else happened and we all got uncomfortable again. And so it's almost as though, where is the strength of us as individuals to be able to say, this is my skin, I'm comfortable with it, this is where I make a stand. And this is a stand that I can build and grow and push out, so I continue pushing myself. Or is this a stand where I can retreat and get frightened? And, you know, so I think the whole idea of complacency is a very real hot issue. People are getting very fatigued by many, many issues. You know, we hear the Close the Gap reports every year, and most of us get extremely depressed. You know, the stuff that's happening with COVID, we're getting very flat from that. The stuff that's happening internationally, we're getting very, very flat from that. So I suppose it's not so much about being comfortable in the world around you, in your own skin, but it's about being comfortable about who you are and where you draw the line and how you challenge yourself. So that line out to be more of who you could be. How can you be your best self?
Yeah, okay. And so it's not fixed. So once you don't just stop once you feel comfortable. It is actually about a developmental process, yeah, and a building on process. It's a continuum. It's a bit like democracy. It's not a thing in itself. It is a process. How about for you, Jason?
Much the same, I think, as the question was being asked. I think when I reflect on it, the people that I know who are the most comfortable in their own skin are probably the least arrogant, the least likely to go, well, I know everything now. That's, you know, it's the people who aren't comfortable in themselves, who have issues with confidence, self-confidence and legitimacy and all of those sorts of things. They tend to be the ones who are the more dig in. Okay, we, you know, nothing more to learn here. Never inclined to admit that they're wrong, never inclined to admit they make mistakes. They're not the people who are comfortable in their own skin. So I think the more comfortable we are in our own skin, the more we're going to progress these agendas.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So I'll just go, we've got a few questions coming in and I'm being conscious of time. There's another question here from Sarah Liebertrail, and she's asking about approaching colleagues or having experiences that are not inclusive or culturally competent when colleagues are not open to hearing feedback. Do you just lead by example or raise it directly and insist on being heard? So this is a really practical question in this one. Lisa, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'm sure Jason will have a fabulous approach to this as well. Look, for me, it's that thing about not walking past a behaviour you'll accept. And it really depends how that person is behaving. If they're telling racist jokes or if they're saying things or doing things they should not be, then you do need to stop. But if someone's not necessarily doing something which is a real burner, I think that whole idea of being what you want to see is important. And I think there's always timing with raising things with colleagues. You don't want to set out an all-out war for something which is, you know, you're just not washing your teacup up after you've used it and you left it in the sink for someone else, versus someone who is being inappropriate, racist or sexist in the workplace, for example. You know, I would probably walk past the teacup and stick a sign up or just remind them they left the cup in the sink. But if someone's doing those other things, then I will say something, I will do something, I will stay, no more, you can't walk past this line because that's a breach.
A couple of really good questions are also coming in, but Jason, do you want to respond to that?
Look, it's the same answer, really. I think it goes back to what I said previously about, you know, you want to notice the behaviours you want to encourage, and you also want to notice the behaviours that you want to discourage, and you call them out and you remind people that those behaviours are not consistent with the values of the organisation or our values as friends or whatever it is. I think it's important to have the conversation. Yeah,
so I guess one of the issues, or sort of for many people, I mean, I experienced this when I was working on the culture strategy, is that there are people in positions that are not powerful and they might be leaders, but you know, when you work in hierarchical organisations, it's hard you can't always pull people up in a way. There might be, I guess there's a sense of retribution or potential harm can be done when you do that. So I think, I mean, I think that's partly what's at stake in that discussion about walking past the behaviour that you accept. There are
I would say you've got, as a leader, you've got to be vigilant. Sorry.
As a leader, yeah, that's right.
You've got to be vigilant of that. So it's, you're not, you know, you're absolutely right. I've been in workplaces, I've gone into workplaces where there are people who have felt that they are being disrespected and they don't have authority, either cultural authority or positional authority to deal with those issues directly. And then it is, the onus is on the leaders to be vigilant, to be observing this stuff, to notice this stuff and to address it.
Yeah. So that is where it's important that people in those positions are also demonstrating the sort of values, are demonstrating cultural competence, which is also obviously partly what's inspired this program in cultural competence leadership. I'll go to an associated question. This comes from Fiona Martin. She says, we're working in a time of great change and uncertainty. How can you apply principles and values of culturally competent leadership to working with people who are fearful, angry, or resistant to essential change? Great question. Picks up on some of what I was just saying. Lisa.
Yeah, no, it is a fantastic question. I think we're getting more and more fear in community, and I think that term, you know, we're all in this together. You know, we are in a situation that if something happens to you, it happens to me. You know, if something happens to my family, or if we don't have enough toilet paper or tissues, then that affects all of us. And I certainly think in the world of COVID, that's one of those things. Coming into Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander world and history and belonging and where we are as a nation today, is that we've put off for a long, long time the conversations that need to be had. We've put off for a long time the conversations about what is history, what does it mean, this place, how is it we can really understand who we are, on a nation that's always been a place of being loved, of learning, of culture and of song. How is it we can truly belong as Australians? And how many more generations do we need to keep putting these conversations off? And as some would say, the reckoning that is to come, how long do we put off this reckoning to generations to come, when they're going to have enough of their own problems with the environment, with the economy and whatever's going to be left over from COVID. So I think that the whole idea of recognising great change and uncertainty is that we have had a lot of change and uncertainty for a long, long time. These times are new to us. But if we look 20, 30, 40 years ago, there was great change and uncertainty, and all of the stuff that brought people up to the 1967 referendum and in Aboriginal Affairs, you'll see that there was a huge amount of uncertainty and fear around that. Prior to that, it was the fear of giving women the vote, like God forbid, or the fear of having women as pilots in aircraft. So there's always been changes, there's always been challenges, and it's really about how do we recognise that we do have a shared vision. All of us want to have a nice, safe future for future generations. All of us want to be able to have good quality food in our bellies. All of us want to be able to go out and breathe nice, clean air. And all of us want to be able to be in nature and part of something bigger that makes us feel loved and wanted and nurtured. They're the common denominators, and I think that's what we need to pay attention to, especially when there is a lot of grief and upset happening in our communities.
Yeah, and I think, and it picks up on, and Jason, I don't want to answer for you, but I think it picks up on some of those things you were talking about before around dignity, leading with dignity and respect, and the Hicks work that you were talking about. Would you like to add to that response?
Yeah, look, I need to say, I think Lisa's right. It's, you know, if you're open to diverse perspectives, then you've got to be open to all perspectives, you know, not just the ones that you feel good about. And so when you're dealing with people who are resistant to change, then it is as important to let them have their say and feel like they've been heard as it is anybody else. And so being open to having those conversations, doing it safely, getting down to, well, where is our common ground? You know, what's good for all of us? Where do we want to be? And starting from there, and I think you can take some of the scariness away from it. I think if you start from, well, let's not work out at the extremes. Let's start in the middle where we can find some common ground and work from there.
Yeah. Okay. So there's only really two more. I'm trying to sort of group some of the questions that we've received. A number of questions also talk about, well, do we need another word instead of leadership, or is leadership a word that we need to just be a bit more comfortable with, or there's a certain sort of acceptance perhaps in that, or are we working towards thinking about a different term?
I'm not one for new terms. My experience would suggest that we find different words, but we just use them the same way and we mean the same things. You know, in my world, I've seen things, you know, citizen-centric to co-design to, you know, different, and they all mean the same thing. Well, what I mean by that is it fundamentally doesn't change our behaviour or our practice. We're just calling it something different. So I don't think it's about that. I think it is more about having the conversation about, when we use these terms, what do we really mean? Okay. What do we really mean by them? What do we, you know?
Yeah, I love what you were saying before, Jason. Leadership really is a verb, right? It's what you do. It's not what you say, and it's not what you think. It's what you do, you know, that action, that activity.
Yeah, and it's also, there's a couple of others that have also picked up on this as well, that when you think about leadership in that way, it's not a matter of a hierarchy. You can actually have that impact working at all sorts of levels of the organisation. And I guess it is working out what your sort of sphere of influence is, or being sort of practical, collaborating with colleagues as well who are thinking similarly. Now, there's another question that's come in. A couple of people have asked about this sort of self-awareness. I guess that's about part of the linchpin around cultural competence, about being sort of aware of one's position in the world in order to then understand that of others. I think that might be sort of pretty much our last question or last point for the day. And let's sort of see that as a way to sort of to wrap up. And it comes back to, I guess, in thinking about what you're saying, Jason, that really coming back down to the individual in this case as well. Actually, would you want to start off, Jason?
So sorry, what is the question?
Well, the question is about self-awareness. I mean, the question, I'll actually read the specific question out, and it's as much a comment as anything. And it's come from Rebecca Rock, and she says, it's sort of a summary of a few of these questions, and it's about the role of self-awareness. I mean, what do you do? I mean, how do you go about it? This kind of mythical self-awareness, where it's not exactly what she said, but it's we're talking about it as if everyone knows what it means.
Yeah.
It's more than that.
Yes. How do you become more self-aware?
Yeah. Yep. Well, what do you do? How do you?
Well, I mean, I go back. There's a quote that I heard a long time ago. That was a fellow by the name of I've got to think of his name now. Charlie Tremendous Jones, I think his name was, and he said, "The difference between the person you are today and the person you'll be in 5 years are the books you read and the people you meet." And I really think it's about that. I mean, you become self-aware by the experiences that you have, don't you? And then hopefully reflecting on those experiences. You know, travel is a great thing, reading is a great thing. You know, making the effort to go out and find people from different backgrounds, from different experiences in different disciplines, and being open to those ideas, and then self-reflecting on, well, okay, how do I feel about these things? What do I think about these things? What does that tell me about the way I operate, the way I relate to people?
Okay, great. So what she's asking is about that, is how you go about being self-aware as you can be. So yeah, Lisa, last word from you.
So I think self-awareness is, you know, quite rightly, how is it I have an impact on others or on my surroundings or on my environment? And there's this little exercise that I learned long time ago, and it was way back, and it was like, you've got your position in your shoes. How is it that you can get a sense of how another person is feeling about what you're doing or about something that's happening to them? What do you need to do to get into that other person's shoes and just have a look through their eyes and get a sense of what's going on? And I think that can be one of the most critical things that you can do to understand where your biases are, where your beliefs are, and where your understandings are. And, you know, again, with Jason, it's very much around that travel, but also reflecting on those things that you learn and what you see, especially that stuff that seems so totally ununderstandable or inexplicable, to question that and to really get into the boots and all of other people's experiences, not as a voyeur, but to appreciate what your reaction's like to that if you have an adverse reaction.
Well, thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Jason, for both being really generous with your